There is a photograph that keeps resurfacing every time the world remembers Princess Diana. A stooped, grieving man at a piano, a golden voice cracking under the weight of Westminster Abbey, singing words that had been written in a matter of minutes because there was no time to write them any other way. Most people who watched Elton John perform Candle in the Wind 1997 on September 6th of that year did not know the full story behind that performance. They did not know about a Charleston dance at a birthday party 16 years earlier, or a friendship that had nearly collapsed under the weight of pride, or a phone call made from a house in the south of France just weeks before the crash that changed everything. This is the real story of Elton John and Princess Diana. Not the whispered rumor of it, but the version Elton John himself eventually chose to tell, in his 2019 memoir Me, and in the interviews that followed it, when he decided that the truth was worth more than the silence he had kept for over 20 years. By the summer of 1981, Elton John was already one of the most famous musicians alive, and he was, somewhat improbably, a familiar face in royal circles. The Queen Mother had been a fan of his music for years, and he had become something of a fixture at the family's more intimate gatherings, close enough to the Windsors that performing for them no longer felt like a novelty. That familiarity was on full display at Prince Andrew's 21st birthday party, held at Windsor Castle, where Elton had been asked to perform alongside percussionist Ray Cooper. He found himself in a strange, almost surreal scene that night, dancing with Princess and the Queen herself, all of them moving to Bill Haley's Rock Around the Clock, while the Queen clutched her handbag through the entire song. Elton later admitted that his main task that evening was simply keeping a straight face, trying, as he put it, to look as though a party like this was a perfectly ordinary state of affairs for him. Everything shifted when a young woman named Diana Spencer walked into the room. She was 20 years old, weeks away from marrying Prince Charles, and not yet the most photographed woman on earth. She wasn't royal yet, not officially, but she was already impossible to ignore. Elton later described her as someone with an almost supernatural gift for putting people at ease, a woman who could make anyone feel completely comfortable in her company within moments of meeting her. That gift was on full display within minutes of her arrival. The two of them ended up dancing the Charleston together in the middle of the ballroom, an unplanned, slightly ridiculous burst of joy at an otherwise formal royal function. It was the kind of spontaneous, unpretentious moment that would come to define their entire friendship. Two people who, on paper, belonged to completely different worlds, finding an immediate and genuine kinship in a room full of protocol and expectation. What made the connection so strong, so fast, wasn't just charm meeting charm. It was recognition. Elton was a flamboyant, openly gay musician who had spent years feeling like an outsider even inside the elite little clique he'd fought so hard to belong to. Diana was about to marry into an institution built on formality, duty, and emotional restraint, one that would soon subject her to a level of scrutiny no 20-year-old could reasonably be prepared for. They were, in their own very different ways, about to become two of the most watched people in Britain, and each of them, without quite realizing it yet, had just found someone who understood what that isolation actually felt like. Through the rest of the 1980s and into the early 1990s, Elton John and Princess Diana built a friendship that operated almost entirely outside the frame of the cameras that followed them everywhere. In public, they were photographed together at galas, concerts, and royal functions, always smiling, always seemingly at ease. But the friendship that mattered to both of them happened away from the flashbulbs, in phone calls, in quiet visits, in the kind of unguarded conversation that neither of them could have with almost anyone else in their lives. Diana, according to Elton, had an extraordinary gift for making the most intimidating people feel instantly at ease, yet she herself rarely felt that same peace. Her marriage to Prince Charles grew colder as the decade wore on, and behind the walls of Kensington Palace she was, by most accounts, deeply unhappy, caught between what was expected of her and what she actually felt. Elton understood a version of that trap intimately. He was fighting his own battles during this period, wrestling with addiction and self-doubt, while performing at the top of his career, constantly scrutinized by a public that only saw the costumes and the headlines. That shared, unspoken understanding of loneliness inside fame became the real foundation of their bond. Diana's compassion wasn't limited to her friendship with Elton. it extended into causes that most public figures of her era wouldn't go near. She became one of the most visible faces of AIDS awareness at a moment when the disease was still widely stigmatized and misunderstood, famously shaking hands with and embracing AIDS patients without gloves, deliberately defying the fear that surrounded the illness at the time. For Elton, who would go on to found the Elton John AIDS Foundation and dedicate much of his life to the cause, her willingness to physically, publicly stand beside people the rest of society had turned away from was proof of exactly who she was underneath the tabloid coverage. He would later say that moment changed how the public understood AIDS. There were lighter sides to the friendship too, plenty of them. Diana had a wicked, mischievous sense of humor that matched Elton's own, and she loved to gently mock his famously flamboyant wardrobe. But nothing captured what Elton called the Diana effect quite as vividly as a dinner party he hosted with his now-husband David Furnish sometime after Diana's 1992 separation from Prince Charles. The guest list included Hollywood stars Richard Gere and Sylvester Stallone, and by Elton's own account, in Me, what unfolded was almost cinematic in its absurdity. Gere and Diana ended up seated by the fireplace, locked in what Elton described as rapt conversation, while Stallone grew visibly agitated watching from across the room. The tension escalated to the point where Stallone reportedly pulled Gere aside for a word, and the whole thing nearly ended in a physical altercation between two of the era's biggest action stars over the attention of a princess. Elton later wrote that the men in her orbit seemed to completely lose their heads around her, utterly bewitched, comparing it to love-struck teenagers rather than grown men. It's the kind of story that sounds invented until you remember it comes from the person who was standing in the room. Behind all of it, though, Diana was carrying weight that few of her friends fully saw. She struggled privately with bulimia and with a persistent feeling of being unloved, even as she filled rooms and captivated everyone in them. Elton would sometimes visit her simply to sit and listen. No audience, no photographers, just two people who had found, almost by accident, a rare space where neither of them had to perform. By the mid-1990s, the friendship between Elton John and Princess Diana was one of the most talked about relationships between a member of the royal family and a global celebrity. They had weathered scandal, media frenzy, and personal crisis side by side. And then, in 1996, it fell apart, not because of a scandal or a public falling out, but over a book. Elton's friend, the designer Gianni Versace, had put together a glamorous coffee table book of rock photography called Rock and Royalty, a fundraising project for Elton's AIDS Foundation. Diana had agreed to write the foreword. For Elton, her involvement wasn't a small favor. It was a statement, another instance of her lending her name and credibility to a cause that still made many public figures uncomfortable. Then, without much warning, she pulled out. The book contained images of semi-nude male models, and according to Elton's own account, Buckingham Palace advisors objected to the idea of a royal being associated with that kind of imagery. Diana, in his words, got cold feet. To Elton, it didn't read as caution. It read as betrayal, and not from a princess weighing palace politics, from a friend he thought he could count on. He let his frustration be known. In one interview years later, he admitted plainly that he wasn't happy about it and had told her so. Diana, feeling cornered by the criticism, responded with what Elton has described as a curt, final letter. And then, silence. For months, they simply stopped speaking. The timing made the rift even harder to repair. Diana's divorce from Prince Charles was finalized in August of 1996, and with it she lost the title Her Royal Highness, a legal and symbolic blow that compounded an already brutal period in her life. She was surrounded, as she often was, by people with competing agendas, and the palace offered little in the way of comfort. Elton privately wondered whether advisors had truly pushed her away from the project, or whether she had simply grown weary of being tied to other people's causes during an already exhausting year. He never fully resolved which explanation was closer to the truth. What he did know was that two people who had once told each other everything had become, almost overnight, strangers. Neither of them made the call that might have ended the silence sooner. Pride, on both sides, got in the way, and by the time either of them was ready to set it aside, an entire year had nearly passed. The rift ended, fittingly and painfully, because of another loss. On July 15, 1997, Gianni Versace, the same friend whose book had driven Diana and Elton apart, was shot and killed outside his Miami Beach mansion. The news devastated both of them individually before it brought them back together. Diana had modeled one of Versace's gowns years earlier and considered him a genuine friend. According to later reporting, she was shaken enough by the murder that she asked her bodyguard whether something similar could happen to her, an unsettling, almost prophetic question given what was still to come. On the day of Versace's death, Diana called Elton at his home in Nice. It was a short, simple call, but it undid a year of silence in a matter of seconds. She told him it had been a silly falling out and that they should be friends again. There was no lecture, no lingering resentment in the exchange, just an acknowledgement, from both sides, that the distance between them had never been worth what it cost. They saw each other again in person soon after, at Versace's funeral in Milan, where a now-famous photograph captured Diana leaning toward Elton in a moment of shared grief. Elton has since gently pushed back on the media's romanticized version of that exact image, noting with his characteristic humor that whatever comfort passed between them in that instant was far less poetic than headlines suggested. What mattered wasn't the framing of the photograph, it was that the friendship, after a year of silence, was intact again. They made plans to see each other soon. They would not get the chance. 6 weeks later, everything changed. In the early hours of August 31st, 1997, Elton John learned that Princess Diana had been killed in a car crash in Paris, in the Pont de l'Alma tunnel, after the vehicle she was traveling in was pursued by photographers. She was 36 years old. Elton has described the news as almost impossible to process. Weeks earlier, they had been standing together at a funeral, mourning someone else, reconciled, and looking forward to seeing each other again. Now it was Diana who was gone. Diana's sister, Lady Sarah McCorquodale, asked Elton to perform at the funeral, which was set to take place at Westminster Abbey on September 6th. With almost no time to prepare something new, Elton turned to his longtime songwriting partner, Bernie Taupin. According to multiple accounts, it was businessman Richard Branson who first suggested that Elton rework Candle in the Wind, Elton and Taupin's 1973 tribute to Marilyn Monroe, after noticing that mourners writing in the official Book of Condolence at St. James's Palace kept quoting lines from the original song. Under the impression that the suggestion had the Spencer family's blessing, Elton called Taupin, who set to work rewriting the lyrics almost immediately. By Taupin's own later account, the revision took him somewhere between 10 minutes and half an hour, a strikingly small amount of time to produce what would become one of the most consequential songs ever written. Taupin has said he wanted the new lyrics to sound less like a single voice and more like an entire country singing together, which is part of why the original's intimate first-person perspective became a broader, third-person tribute in the new version. On September 6, 1997, Elton John sat down at the piano inside Westminster Abbey in front of a global television audience estimated in the hundreds of millions and performed the reworked song, now beginning with the line "Goodbye, England's Rose." He was reportedly so anxious about the performance, his only live performance of the reworked song, ever, that a teleprompter had to be installed by the piano so he wouldn't risk forgetting the words in front of the world. He later described a strange, disorienting sensation of feeling like the entire planet was watching him for those few minutes, while knowing, all the same, that the moment had nothing to do with him at all. It was about her. The single version of Candle in the Wind in 1997, released with proceeds going to the Diana, Princess of Wales Memorial Fund, went on to sell more than 33 million copies, making it one of the best-selling singles in recorded history. Despite that staggering commercial success, Elton has never treated the record as something to celebrate. He has said publicly that he never felt proud of it, that the idea of anyone choosing to listen to it for pleasure struck him as strange, because for him the song was never a hit. It was a wound. Elton's connection to Diana didn't end at her funeral. In the decades since, he has remained close to her sons, particularly Prince Harry, who wrote about Elton's presence at the funeral in his own memoir, describing him rising to sing as though he were one of the ancient kings entombed beneath the abbey, suddenly called back to life. In 2019, when Harry and his wife came under intense media criticism over a private flight to Elton's home in France, Elton publicly defended them, writing that Harry's mother had been one of his dearest friends and that he felt a genuine obligation to shield Harry and his family from the kind of press intrusion that had contributed to Diana's death. It was a rare, direct acknowledgement from Elton of just how much responsibility he still felt, more than 2 decades later, toward the family of the friend he danced to Charleston with as a young woman in 1981. Elton has also been candid, in interviews given long after Diana's death, about the year they lost to silence and pride. He has said that if he could go back and do it differently, he would have simply picked up the phone and apologized, rather than waiting for circumstance, in this case, another person's death, to force the reconciliation. It's a small, human regret sitting inside an enormous public story, and it's part of what makes Elton's account of the friendship feel less like royal mythology and more like an honest reckoning with how ordinary human failures, pride, hurt feelings, stubbornness, can quietly cost people time they don't get back. What made Elton John and Princess Diana's friendship so unusual wasn't just the unlikely pairing of a flamboyant rock star and a future princess. It was that neither of them ever quite fit the role the world had assigned them, and in each other they found rare permission to be something closer to themselves. Diana was expected to be composed, restrained, endlessly poised, and with Elton she could gossip, joke, tease, and be, by his own description, wonderfully indiscreet. Elton was expected to be larger than life, endlessly performing, and with Diana, he found someone who saw past the costumes to the insecurity and loneliness that fame never fully erased. Their bond survived scandal, weathered a very real rupture over pride and misunderstanding, and was ultimately sealed, almost unbearably, by 2 funerals 6 weeks apart, one that brought them back together, and one that took Diana away for good. What's left of that friendship now lives mostly in the record Elton chose to leave behind. In his memoir, in interviews, in a song he still refuses to celebrate despite it becoming one of the most successful recordings ever made, and in the quiet, ongoing loyalty he's shown to Diana's sons in the years since. It is, in the end, a very human story dressed in the trappings of royalty and fame, about 2 people who found each other in a crowded room, nearly lost each other over pride, and never quite got the chance to grow old as friends the way they probably assumed they would.